Imagine you wake up and it's all over. The superpower that once ruled the world has faced a major financial crash. The dollar is now worthless. Other countries around the world have lost complete trust in the one economic powerhouse that they once all thought they could rely on. And there's lines down the street just to get the bare essentials. And the crazy part is, everyone should have seen it coming. This has all happened before, and it will happen again. The warning signs are always there. But the real question is this concept all truth or is it all scare? And that is what we'll unpack on this episode of Truth or Scare. But before we get into it, my name's Nolan, Matthias. And if you want the truth, the real truth about finance and economics, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's discuss the next big superpower's financial collapse. Because right now, the US is without a doubt the world's economic superpower. And just like every superpower before it, there's always the potential for a financial catastrophe. But the question is, how bad will it really be? And is it right around the corner? Because as great of a platform as YouTube is, a lot of people have been given a voice to talk about things that perhaps they understand and perhaps they don't. And while I don't claim to know everything, I can tell you without a doubt that the level of fear associated with economic collapse, especially with respect to the United States, is at a level that it has never been at before. And that's not to say that there shouldn't be concern, but the reality is, it's probably not as bad as many people would have you believe. So in this video, I want to talk about the history, and I want to talk about the warning signs that seem so obvious, but maybe aren't as obvious as many people believe. And we need to start by discussing the US national debt. $36.22 trillion at the moment of this filming. The annual deficit is now over $1.5 trillion. And in the same way that debt has significant ramifications for an individual, debt also has significant ramifications for a country. And in many cases, it is debt that collapses empires. And not only that, there's lessons from the past that we need to be paying attention to. Things like ancient Rome, who devalued their currency by mixing lead and copper with gold, causing the currency to lose value quickly. And we've seen it over the last several years. The US has printed money in a way that they've never printed money before in order to deal with things like the financial crisis and COVID. And that has led to a significant loss in purchasing power, which in the past has been an indication that a superpower is on the brink of collapse. And not only that, in the same way that in the early 1940s, we saw many countries moving away from the British currency, we're starting to see the BRICS nations move away from the US currency, losing trust in the currency that was once deemed the gold standard. And yes, there's a pun intended there. And not only that, we're seeing rising wealth inequality and social unrest. The top 1% now own more than the bottom 90%. Billionaires are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And this is a consistent theme throughout economic collapse. We almost always see social unrest right before the inevitable happens. And whether it was Rome or the USSR, this social unrest has been a key indicator that has sounded the warning bells. And in almost every case, not only has there been economic warning signs, but there's also been military warning signs. Military overreach and endless wars seems to be a leading indicator of things going wrong. We saw that in ancient Rome, we saw that in Great Britain during World War I and World War II, and we saw that when the USSR overextended themselves in an effort to compete with the USA. And when you look at the current landscape, the US currently has more military bases than any other country, spread out across the world. We've spent the last 20 to 30 years fighting endless wars, and it seems like the conflicts and the potential for conflicts is only increasing. And not only that, from a military perspective, the US outspends the next biggest country by 10x when it comes to military spending. And just as it seems there's a new era in US politics and everything will be okay, the reality is that there's always a massive amount of denial and a false sense of security right before an empire collapses. Because empires never believe that they're going to fail. There's this notion that just like big companies in 2008 were too big to fail, that a country like the US is also too big to fail. And whether it was Rome, Britain, or the USSR, they all faced the same scenario, and they all ignored the warning signs. The warning signs that always led to the next big superpower crisis. In the past, in hindsight, it's always been clear. It's debt, it's inflation, and it's social unrest. But there's one thing that all the YouTubers and all the people that are claiming that the US is in trouble are failing to recognize. And that's the fact that superpowers don't collapse overnight. It is not something that is 1 month or 3 months or 6 months or even 12 months down the road. It takes superpowers years, often decades, to fail. And while it can be argued that the US is potentially in a position where they are starting the failure process, there is yet to be a clear alternative present itself, which means that the US likely has at least a decade or 2 or 3 before it is really in trouble. But from an economic standpoint, that doesn't mean that the US is bulletproof. Because yes, there are inevitably going to be hard times ahead. Recessions, financial crises, and even potentially depressions. But here's the reality, none of us can predict when this is going to happen. All we can do is be prepared for the worst and hope for the best. Because the economic collapse or the next recession or the bad things that are coming down the road are anybody's guess. Nobody can predict when they are coming. So what is important is not what the pundits are saying, not what you're seeing on YouTube, not what you're watching from guys like me. What's important is that you create financial stability for yourself, financial independence, and financial toughness. And what that means is quite simply this: understanding how money works, knowing that debt, no matter what the YouTubers tell you, is the enemy, and understanding that investing wisely and reducing risk. And by the way, reducing risk often means reducing debt. The notion that you should be borrowing money to invest is absolutely absurd. And Warren Buffett said it best, and I'm going to paraphrase here. If you're smart, you don't need leverage. And if you're dumb, it'll absolutely destroy you. So getting out of debt and then setting up a program, a budget, whatever you want to call it, in order to put money away on a monthly basis, spend less than what you earn, and accumulate cash, and not just cash, but assets, investments, in a balanced portfolio. One that isn't all gold and all Bitcoin, but one that has a mix of bonds and stocks, and yes, gold and potentially a little bit of Bitcoin, that reduces your exposure, reduces your risk, is the way that you minimize your risk in the event that there is a financial crisis. And take a note from billionaires right now. Look at what the wealthy are doing. They're moving their money to hard assets. Bill Gates is buying farmland. You can do the same. Buy land, buy housing, and invest wisely in a portfolio that isn't reliant on one stock or one type of investment doing well. Look at what Warren Buffett just did with Apple. When it got to the point where Apple was more than 50% of Berkshire Hathaway's holdings, he liquidated the stock in order to make sure that he wasn't overexposed to one investment. And many people are saying that this is him preparing for a depression or recession like 1929 or 2008, but it's not. It's simply him rebalancing his portfolio so his money isn't at risk. And you should be doing the same. And here's the reality. The question of whether or not we're at the brink of a financial crisis or a superpower failure is anybody's guess. My guess is we're probably not. Is there going to be recessions? Yes. Could there be bad ones? Absolutely. But is another superpower about to take over the US's role as the leading global superpower? It's not likely, at least not in the next decade or two. And in the same way that the lessons from history tell us that we need to be prepared, they also tell us that we have a runway, one that gives us some time to prepare for the inevitable, if it actually is that. So in my mind, you shouldn't be worried about the US failing. You shouldn't be worried about the next big global collapse. What you should be worried about is your own personal finances and making sure you aren't exposed to your next big personal collapse. And the reality is money is easy. It's a game. And if you figure out how to play the game, you can win. And if you win, you don't ever have to worry about what happens externally in the form of a recession, a crisis, or anything else. Oh, and by the way, if you want to see what always happens before a financial crisis, make sure you check out this video right here.